For 10 years, my world was 22 square feet of beige carpet, a second-hand ergonomic chair, and the perpetually humming server rack that lived in the closet behind me. My universe was the life of one man, Mr. Alastair Sterling. I wasn't just his executive assistant. I was his architect, his gatekeeper, his memory. I knew he liked his coffee black, 2 sweeteners, stirred twice clockwise, at precisely 7:15 a.m. I knew his wife's birthday, his mother's favorite flowers, and the specific brand of antacid he needed after a contentious quarterly review. I was the ghost in his machine, the silent engine that made the gleaming locomotive of his career barrel down the tracks of success. My life was a series of meticulously planned sacrifices. I missed my sister's wedding because he had a last-minute merger meeting in Zurich. I spent my 30th birthday collating documents for a hostile takeover bid, eating a sad cupcake under the fluorescent glare of the office lights at 2 a.m. I told myself it was worth it. I believed in him, you see. I believed in the vision he sold, this grand idea of building something that would last. I saw him as a titan, a brilliant mind, and I was proud, deeply proud, to be the person who made sure the titan had his armor polished and his sword sharpened every single day. My routine was a well-oiled machine. I was in the office by 6, an hour before anyone else. I'd prepare his daily briefing, a document so detailed it tracked everything from stock market fluctuations in Asia to the weather forecast in whatever city his plane would be landing in. I screened his calls, managed his impossibly complex calendar, and drafted his emails with such precision that he often just hit send, without reading them. People in the office saw me, but they didn't see me. I was a fixture, like the ficus in the lobby or the abstract art no one understood. I was just Alastair's girl. They'd smile politely, a vacant, dismissive sort of smile, as they passed my desk on their way to the real centers of power, to the corner offices where decisions were made. I didn't mind. Or rather, I told myself I didn't. My validation came from Alastair. A simple, "Good work, Elena," from him was enough to fuel me for a week. I had hitched my wagon to his star, and I truly believed that as he rose, he would pull me up with him. I saw myself growing old with the company, perhaps eventually being given a small department to run, a quiet acknowledgement of my years of silent, unwavering loyalty. That was the dream I watered every day with my own sweat and sacrifice time. The day it all shattered started like any other. It was the day of the big audit, the culmination of a year-long investigation into our competitor, a company called Apex Dynamics, which we were in the final stages of acquiring. The air in the office was electric with a nervous energy. This deal was Alastair's masterpiece, the move that would cement his legacy. I had prepared everything for him, every file, every projection, every possible question the auditors could ask. I had stayed up for 3 straight nights, cross-referencing everything, making sure it was perfect. He was confident, almost swaggering, as he walked into the main conference room, the one we called the arena. I took my usual spot, a small chair against the wall, slightly behind him, ready with my laptop to pull up any document he might need. The auditors were stone-faced, a panel of gray suits who didn't seem impressed by Alastair's charisma. They started asking questions, sharp, pointed questions about a series of transactions from 2 years prior. It was a minor detail, something I had flagged for Alastair a month ago. I had found a discrepancy in the initial Apex filings, a potential liability that was cleverly hidden. I wrote a memo, a clear, concise warning. I had placed it directly on his desk, in the red folder I used for urgent matters. I watched him pick it up. I watched him scan it. And then I watched him toss it into a shredder. "Corporate jitters, Elena," he'd said with a wave of his hand. "Don't worry about it. I'll handle it." Now, in the arena, the auditors were circling that exact issue. Their lead investigator, a woman with eyes like chips of ice, presented a document on the main screen. It was a clear violation of SEC regulations. A deal killer. The room went silent. I could feel the blood drain from my face, because I knew what it was. It was the liability I had warned him about. I saw a flicker of panic in Alastair's eyes, a rare sight. He stammered for a moment, then he did something I will never forget. He composed himself, straightened his tie, and a cold, calm mask slid over his face. He looked at the auditors, then he turned, ever so slightly, and pointed a finger directly at me. "This is on her," he said, his voice ringing with false disappointment. "My assistant, Elena. She was responsible for the due diligence on this file." I trusted her implicitly. Clearly, that trust was misplaced. Her oversight is inexcusable. The eyes in the room, all of them, swiveled to me. The auditors, the board members, my colleagues, their looks were a mixture of pity and contempt. I felt like I had been physically struck. I couldn't breathe. My mind was a roaring vacuum. I opened my mouth to speak, to say, "But the memo? I told you." But my voice was gone. He had already turned back to the auditors. "She will, of course, be terminated immediately. I take full responsibility for my poor judgment in hiring. Now, let's talk about how we can rectify her mistake." He didn't even look at me again. I was dismissed, erased, a piece of trash to be swept away so the important business could continue. I stood up, my legs trembling, and walked out of that room. No one said a word. The silence was the most violent sound I had ever heard. I packed the few personal items from my desk, the photo of my parents, a small potted plant, into a cardboard box. The walk to the elevator felt a mile long, a parade of shame past all the faces that had ignored me for a decade. Now they stared, their eyes burning into my back. That was the moment my world collapsed. It was the deepest pain I'd ever felt. If you've ever gone through a great betrayal and you know what it's like to have your heart shattered, please like this video so I know I'm not alone on this journey. The weeks that followed are a gray, formless blur in my memory. The shame was a physical weight, a thick blanket that suffocated me day and night. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that conference room, the phantom weight of all those stares pressing down on me. I didn't just lose a job, I lost my identity. For 10 years, I had been Alistair's Elena. Without him, who was I? My entire sense of self-worth had been outsourced to a man who had discarded me like a used coffee cup. I tried to find another job, of course. I polished my resume, highlighting my decade of experience at one of the top firms in the city. But the corporate world is small, and whispers travel faster than light. I was the assistant who made the colossal mistake, the one who almost scuttled the Apex deal. No one would even call me back for an interview. My name was poison. The savings I had meticulously built up, the nest egg I imagined would one day be a down payment on a small apartment, began to evaporate. First went the emergency fund, then the vacation fund, then the retirement savings. I moved from my clean, respectable apartment to a cramped, third-floor walk-up in a neighborhood that never slept. The sirens were my nightly lullaby. My diet became a rotation of instant noodles and cheap bread. The worst part was the loneliness. It was a cold that seeped into my bones. The friends I had were work friends, and they had chosen their side, or rather, the side that still signed their paychecks. My calls went unanswered. My texts were left unread. I was a leper, a ghost haunting the edges of a life I no longer had access to. I remember one particular night, sitting on the floor of my new, barren apartment, the electricity having been cut off earlier that day. I was staring at a single candle flame, watching the wax drip down and harden, and I thought, this is it. This is me. A puddle of hardened, useless wax. My life is over. That was the bottom. The absolute, rock-hard, can't fall any further bottom. I spent my days in a haze and my nights in a state of agitated wakefulness. To distract myself from the gnawing hunger and the echoing silence, I started going to the public library. It was free, it was warm, and no one there knew my name or my story. I was just another anonymous face among the shelves. I started reading anything and everything just to occupy the screaming void in my head. I drifted from fiction to history to science. And then, one rainy afternoon, I found myself in the legal section. I picked up a book on corporate law, the dry, dense kind of textbook that would put most people to sleep. But for me, it was something else entirely. As I read about torts and fiduciary duties and the labyrinthine rules of the SEC, a strange feeling began to bloom in my chest. It wasn't just understanding, it was recognition. I started to see the machinery behind the world that had chewed me up and spit me out. I saw the language, the structure, the hidden levers of power that men like Alistair Sterling used to build their empires and crush their obstacles. I wasn't just reading, I was dissecting the beast that had devoured me. This led me to a book on forensic accounting, the art of finding the story hidden in the numbers. It was like a key turning in a lock I never knew existed. All those years of managing Alistair's complex expense reports, of tracking budgets and cross-referencing invoices, it hadn't just been administrative work. I had been training my eye to see patterns, to spot inconsistencies. I had a knack for it, a real, untapped talent, a tiny, fragile spark ignited in the darkness of my mind. I started devouring every book I could find on the subject. I used the library's computers to take free online courses. I spent hours learning about shell corporations, asset tracing, and the subtle art of hiding money in plain sight. It became my obsession. It was the first thing in months that didn't feel like a dead end. It felt like a weapon. I wasn't just a failed assistant anymore. I was a student of the very game that had defeated me. I found a hidden purpose in the fine print. And in that quiet, dusty corner of the public library, surrounded by the forgotten knowledge of strangers, a new version of myself began, ever so slowly, to take shape. It wasn't much, just a flicker in an overwhelming darkness, but for the first time in a long time, it was enough. That small spark became my entire world. I traded sleep for study, pouring every ounce of my remaining energy into this newfound knowledge. My tiny apartment, once a symbol of my failure, transformed into a command center. The walls were covered in sticky notes with legal precedents and accounting principles. My floor was a sea of library books and printouts from online legal journals. I was broke, exhausted, and running on cheap coffee, but I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't for Alistair. This wasn't for a paycheck. This was for me. I needed to prove that my mind was worth more than just remembering how a man liked his coffee. The first step was terrifying. I used the last $50 in my bank account to print 100 cheap business cards. They were simple, black and white, and read, Elena Vance. Contract and document analysis. Finding the details others miss. I felt like a fraud, but I pushed the feeling down. I started visiting small business centers and community hubs, pinning my card to cork boards, leaving a small stack on tables. For weeks, nothing. The silence was deafening, and the seeds of doubt began to sprout again. Maybe this was just a fantasy, another dead end. And then one Tuesday morning, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. A hesitant voice on the other end belonged to a woman named Maria, who owned a small bakery a few towns over. She was crying. She told me she was about to lose her business, a bakery that had been in her family for 3 generations. A supplier had locked her into a new contract that she hadn't fully understood, and now they were using a clause to demand an exorbitant payment she couldn't possibly make. They were threatening to seize her assets. She was desperate. She had seen my card and figured she had nothing left to lose. I met her that afternoon. She handed me a thick, convoluted contract, her hands trembling. I took it back to my apartment, and for the next 48 hours, I lived inside that document. I read every line, every clause, every piece of boilerplate legal jargon. I cross-referenced it with state commerce laws. I barely ate or slept. My world shrank to the words on those pages. And then, at 3 in the morning on the second night, I found it. It was a single sentence, buried deep in a subclause on page 37. A tying arrangement clause that was, in our state, completely illegal. It was designed to be overlooked, a predator's trap hidden in plain sight. It invalidated the entire section of the contract they were using against her. My heart hammered against my ribs. The next morning, I called Maria and explained it to her in simple, clear terms. I wrote an official letter for her, citing the specific statute the supplier had violated. 2 days later, she called me back, sobbing again, but this time with tears of joy. The supplier had backed down immediately, terrified of a lawsuit. They had canceled the debt. Her bakery was safe. She insisted on paying me, and though I resisted, she stuffed $200 in cash into my hand. It felt like $1 million. But it wasn't the money. It was the look on her face, the sound of her voice, the knowledge that I had used my mind to save something good and real. That was my first true victory. It was a taste of a power I never knew I possessed. Maria became my biggest advocate. She told everyone, other shop owners, her customers, her friends. My phone started ringing. A freelance graphic designer being cheated by a big client. A family fighting an insurance company that refused to pay out. A small nonprofit trying to navigate the paperwork for a grant. These weren't high-powered corporate cases. These were people like me, People who were being overlooked, ignored, and taken advantage of by systems designed to confuse them. And I could help them. My work became my life. I wasn't just reading the fine print anymore. I was translating it, demystifying it. I was giving people a fighting chance. Within a year, I had enough clients to move out of my horrible apartment and rent a small, one-room office above a coffee shop. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The sign on the door, in simple black letters, said, Vance Consulting. I had a reputation. People started calling me the fine print finder. I was no longer the victim of a corporate shark. I was the person the little fish called when the sharks started circling. My past no longer felt like a brand of shame. It felt like a training ground. It had given me the empathy to understand my clients' desperation and the resilience to fight for them. It was right there with my own two hands that I started to rewrite my story. I stopped being the victim and became the author of my own destiny. If my journey of overcoming is inspiring you, subscribe to the channel to follow the next chapters and become part of this community of new beginnings. Another 2 years passed. Vance Consulting was no longer just me in a tiny room. I had hired 2 other people, a bright young paralegal and a retired accountant, and we had a proper office downtown. We weren't a big firm, but we were respected. We had carved out a niche for ourselves, defending the Davids against the Goliaths. I was happy. Truly, deeply content in a way I never had been when I was just a shadow in Alistair Sterling's world. And then, one Thursday afternoon, my past walked right through my office door. I looked up from a contract I was reviewing, and there he was, Alistair Sterling. He looked older. There were lines of stress around his eyes that I had never seen before, and his expensive suit seemed to hang off his frame. He stood there awkwardly in my reception area, looking completely out of place, like a king in a peasant's hut. My assistant, bless her heart, didn't know who he was and asked him if he had an appointment. I stood up, my heart a cold, steady drum in my chest. "It's all right, Sarah," I said. "I'll take this." I led him into my office, the same office he could have bought 100 times over with his pocket change, and closed the door. He didn't sit. He just stared at me, a strange mix of disbelief and desperation in his eyes. "Elena," he said, his voice raspy. "You look good." I didn't say anything. I just waited. He finally broke, the words tumbling out of him in a rushed, panicked stream. The firm was in trouble. Big trouble. A massive, company-wide federal audit. They were being accused of systemic fraud, going back years. Their high-priced lawyers were stumped. They were facing sanctions that would bankrupt the company and potential criminal charges for the board. For him. "They're going to destroy us, Elena," he pleaded. "Everything I built. It's all going to be gone." He wanted me to help him. He had heard about my work, about my unique skill set. He opened his briefcase and offered me a check. The number written on it had so many zeros, I momentarily lost count. It was more money than I had ever dreamed of. 5 years ago, I would have wept with gratitude. I would have done anything for that kind of validation from him. I looked at the check, then I looked at his desperate, pleading face, and I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, just a profound and immense distance. "No," I said, my voice even and calm. He stared at me, stunned. "What?" "Elena, you don't understand. I'll double it." He was trying to buy me, just like he had bought my loyalty all those years ago. "It's not about the money, Alistair," I said, and for the first time, I sat down behind my desk. My desk. I was in control now. "You want my help? Here are my terms. This is not a negotiation." I leaned forward, my hands flat on the polished wood. "First, you will issue a public, written apology to me, retracting every word you said in that boardroom. It will be circulated to every employee at your company and published in the city's financial journal. Second, you will make a substantial donation, in my name, to a legal aid fund that provides services for people who have been wrongfully terminated. And third, my fee will not be a flat sum. It will be a percentage of the total savings I secure for your company, payable to Vance Consulting, not to me personally." He looked like I had slapped him. His pride, his arrogance, it was all warring with the raw fear in his eyes. He opened his mouth to argue, but I held up a hand. "Those are the terms. If you don't like them, the door is right behind you. I'm sure some other high-priced firm will be happy to take your money and watch you burn." He stood there for a full minute, the silence stretching between us. I could see the battle raging within him. But in the end, fear won. "All right," he whispered, his voice defeated. "I agree." I spent the next 2 weeks buried in his company's financials. It was a mess, a deliberate and complex web of deception. But the man who had built that web was arrogant, and arrogant men make mistakes. I found it. A single, obscure tax code loophole from a decade prior, something so archaic no one would have thought to look for it. It allowed for the restructuring of certain assets in a way that was completely legal, but highly unconventional. It was the only way, the needle in a continent-sized haystack. It would save the company, but it would also expose the sloppy and fraudulent accounting they had been doing for years, forcing them into a period of painful, but necessary, transparency. I presented my findings not to Alastair, but to the board and the federal auditors. I laid out the rescue plan, my plan, with cold, irrefutable logic. Alastair sat at the end of the table, silent, a ghost at his own funeral. He did everything I had demanded. The apology was published. The donation was made. And the fee that was wired to my firm's bank account was staggering, enough to secure our future for years to come. I had saved his company, but I had done it on my terms, and in doing so, I had forced him to reckon with his own sins. I never saw him again after that. My legacy wasn't saving his corrupt empire. My legacy is in the small victories, in the bakery that's still open, in the designer who got paid what she was owed, in the families we fought for. My peace comes from the quiet satisfaction of my work, from knowing that I turned the deepest wound of my life into a source of strength for others. Today, I understand that the wounds of the past don't define who we are, but what we do with them, yes. I am incredibly grateful that you have listened to my story this far. If it touched you, share it with someone who might need a little light and leave a comment with a word of strength and hope. Together, we are stronger.